the world of fiction really comes down to whether, you have enough people who like the voice and want to keep moving through the story. And, hopefully that is what is keeping people engaged and, making the stories work for readers who pick them up.
What do you think you've done differently that other people didn't do to be able to bring something of this level to reality?
I realized pretty quickly that if I was going to tell a story from the lens of a CIA officer, an analyst wasn't going to be the most interesting. A real analyst wasn't going to be the most interesting and dynamic way to do that. And any other part of the book, it was spending a lot of time with those people, asking a lot of questions, and frankly, just kind of listening to the way they talk, how they tell stories, what seems important to them.
That this is like a cause, and that this matters, and that this is going to be big.
My case officer colleagues will say has a lot of the best assets, they're volunteers because they've kind of already crossed that line themselves. They just need a little bit of help to do it. No, I know, but it's the word you use. Yeah.
This source is no longer providing information. It's terminated. They didn't kill somebody.
What's motivating somebody can be a very simple thing.
I don't need money. I'm doing this for my country, not for your country. First, let's start. When does Moscow X come out?
You are looking for something here. This isn't just a breezy, we're all hanging out and it's fine if in 6 months.
How do you write that? Because it's such a feeling.
I'm digging around, right, to find where that energy is. I'm spending a lot of time and doing a lot of research to get all this stuff dialed in and right so I can really tell the story authentically and accurately.
Welcome to Innovation Leadership. I'm Jess Larsen. On this episode, I'm really excited to have David McCloskey, former CIA intelligence analyst at McKinsey. But the reason I'm so excited is he's written one of the best spy books in the last 2 decades. And his second book is about to come out. David, thanks for doing this.
Jess, thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
So I'm going to start with I'm not going to read all the praise for your books because it would take us too long.
Please don't. Yeah.
But I hadn't heard of Damascus Station at all from anybody. And I don't know, it just randomly came up on Audible. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what this one's about. And listeners on this show, I'm sure so sick of me talking about the 950 business books I've listened to in the last dozen plus years. I'm like a 2 to 4 books a week kind of guy. Okay.
There's no business lessons in Damascus Station. Yeah. There's no business.
Are you kidding? There are tons of business lessons. Okay. But what I don't talk about as often is, that I've done 400 plus books in the Jason Bourne, espionage, special operations, fiction arena. And, I got to tell you, it's tough because for me, I love the Vince Flynn's and the Greg Hurwitz and these books so much, but then you get through them all and it's now I got to wait for another year to get, an actual Delta Force guy like Brad Taylor to have his book come out again. And it's kind of a lot of garbage. The 80-20 principle is alive and well in your area. There's a large percentage of people who have a tough time writing something that gives you the you were there feeling. And so, again, coming into it with no preconceived conditions, I was completely blown away. I've talked to so many people about your book. At Child Rescue Association, we actually have we have a number of former collectors, humenters, involved in a new program we're putting together for law enforcement to learn how to recruit sources in organized crime and gangs that are trafficking children in America. And we literally gave your book. I've heard you talk about how to keep your classified brain, your unclassified brain separate, right? And you're like, okay, can I find this principle that, Assad is sleeping with his employees'
Totally.
wives? Can I find that in the public? You know what I mean? And so it's no, this did not come from a classified Syria briefing. I can verify.
That's right.
We're actually using your book as part of a recruitment class that we're teaching cops because my guys can't teach classified stuff.
Well, thank you for incorporating it. I hope it does not let you down.
Well, so I want to talk about both praise for the new one, Moscow X, and for Damascus Station, and just read some of these names, which a bunch of people won't know, and the people who know are going to be impressed. Okay. So Jack Carr, Navy SEAL Jack Carr, Dave Ignatius wrote Body of Lies, so many great books. Leon Panetta, former director of CIA, former secretary of defense. Dan Hoffman, former chief CIA, Middle East operations, 3-time chief of station. General David Petraeus. Mark Grenny with Gray Man series. Brad Thor with Scott Harvath, Greg Hurwitz, Orphan X. And then for me, other guests who have been on the show, who are former lifelong humaniters, like Jim Lawler, who wrote Living Lies, and like Doug London, who wrote The Recruiter, and Mark Polymeropoulos. I can never say his name right.
Polymeropoulos.
Polymeropoulos. I still didn't get it right.
Yeah, no, very few people do. He won't be offended by that.
Yeah. What a great guy, by the way.
Great
I'm
guy.
a fan.
Wonderful human. Yes.
But for a first-time author to have such resonance, you have done something really uncommon. And I want to talk about this. What do you think is different about the way you've written into this is a huge genre. Obviously, tens of millions have made over the last decades with these books and turning them into movies and this stuff. And for you to literally jump to the top of the top, you from book one, we're like guys that serious are comparing you to John le Carré and stuff. What do you think you've done differently that other people didn't do to be able to bring something of this level to reality?
I wish I knew the answer to that question, because it would probably be helpful to know. I think, look, I'll actually just strip it down to the studs a little bit and say, I think ultimately whether or not your books succeed or get readers, success is a tough word to use in the business because it kind of depends where you're drawing those lines. But to have people read it and like it, and to have a large number of them read it and like it, you kind of have to have people say, I like this voice. As a storyteller, you kind of just need them to say, I'm in. I'm a couple pages into the story and I just like the voice, and so I'm going to move ahead with it. Which frankly is how I interact with most fiction that I read, where I know after 2 pages if I'm going to like it or not. I know, and I know if I'll read 2 pages of a book sometimes and put it down because I'll say I don't like the voice and I don't want to travel along on the ride. So I don't know really. We could talk a little bit about some of the thematic choices I've made and how I've chosen to portray the agency or the setting of the novels. But ultimately, I think this, success or lack thereof in the world of fiction really comes down to whether, you have enough people who like the voice and want to keep moving through the story. And, hopefully that is what is keeping people engaged and, making the stories work for readers who pick them up.
Yeah. It's interesting how many people don't know about the Syria-Russia connection, of my friends, right? It's interesting. I'm really liking Code Red right now, the Kyle Mills, Mitch Rapp book, right? And I don't know if you've gotten into it, but it's
I haven't very. That's the most recent one, right? Did it come out weeks ago? I think.
I think a week ago.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll spoil it for people a little bit. Mitch Rapp ends up in Syria, thinking he's dealing with the Syrian problem, and it ends up being a Russian problem. So, to me, I'm going to make some assumptions, and I want you to correct me. Okay. My guess is deep context for the subject matter is obvious, right? I will say I was very surprised to find out you were an analyst, not a humaniter, because I've spent so much time with people who actually go recruit sources in the last decade that you sound like them in many ways. But I was also surprised to hear that as an analyst, you actually got to meet with some sources in Syria. Can you talk about getting inside the head of a humaniter to write this way when that wasn't necessarily your exact life?
Yeah, so I think, look, when I was starting the process of actually turning what was basically 100,000 words of rambling processing of the Syrian war into the structure of a novel, I realized pretty quickly that if I was going to tell a story from the lens of a CIA officer, an analyst wasn't going to be the most interesting. A real analyst wasn't going to be the most interesting and dynamic way to do that. And as I had spent time with a lot of case officers inside CIA, and then frankly have, gotten to know many of them much better since I've been out, I was pretty struck at how interesting, at how wrong, and sometimes intentionally so, a lot of spy fiction gets that job. And certainly its depiction in Hollywood and stuff, you have this image of superhero spies running around, and it's really not accurate in most cases. But the actual work, I thought there's so much human drama there that it was just really fertile ground for the characters in my books. And so I was like, all right, I'm going to do a book starting with Damascus Station and then Moscow X, continued that with CIA case officers, people who are out there actually, spotting, assessing, developing, and recruiting human sources. What I did to understand how those people act and think, and, what the job actually is, what the tradecraft looks like, was really no different than the research kind of process I would use for, any other part of the book. It was spending a lot of time with those people, asking a lot of questions, and frankly, just kind of listening to the way they talk, how they tell stories, what seems important to them, little tics that they have. It is just observing, I'm an analyst, but I've spent a lot of time observing them in their natural habitat. And so I think I have a way I felt like that gave me ammunition to then tell a good story with one of, with a case officer and case officers at its center. So, I think there is something, there's something very valuable in writing to have lived through something, or lived the role, to have actually done the things you're writing about, or been to the places you're writing about. Those things matter. You can still write really, really compelling fiction and stories, even if you haven't lived it. Because that's a lot of the job of the writer and the storyteller is to tell stories, or to bring these stories forth onto the page. It doesn't mean that you have to have done all of it. It's fiction. But and that stuff can be helpful. But it's listening and then telling those stories on the page, and really making sure that I'm spending a lot of time and doing a lot of research to get all this stuff dialed in and right, so I can really tell the story authentically and accurately.
Yeah. I mean, to me, there are so many business lessons. But one of them is I've especially in the last couple of years spent a lot more time getting founders who grew a company from zero over $1 billion, and sometimes into the tens of billions. You had Chip Wilson, who grew Lululemon to $47 billion, or Eric Wan, who grew Zoom to $17 billion, right? And when I talk to them, I'm like, okay, tell us your $1 billion success secrets, right? They're usually much more simple than you would think.
Yeah.
And they just live them much more deeper, okay? But the crossover with the recruitment cycle, to me, is undeniable. They're constantly, spotting, assessing, and recruiting the right investor. Spotting, assessing, recruiting the right senior team members. Their large enterprise clients. There is so much crossover in the intention of being able to read humans, being able to motivate humans, being able to intrigue humans. It's funny, these guys who don't listen to each other's episodes, when I say, okay, how do you get the absolute best staff? And so at first they talk about spotting and assessing, is this going to be the right fit culturally? Do they have the right background? Do they, are they going to be able to deal with the uncertainty? All these kind of things, right? And I'm like, okay, great. But how do you, that's how you choose them. How do you get them to choose you? Over and over and over. They're like, oh, that's easy, Jess. I'm like, what? You just talked about such an elite person who's got $1 million offer to go do AI for Google. What do you mean that's easy? But this is what they say. Oh, that's easy, Jess. It's the vision. Can you transfer the enthusiasm? Can you get them to become a believer that this is a cause, and that this matters, and that this is going to be big, and that this is worth putting it all on the line and giving up the cushy job and the guaranteed stock options at such and such big company to be a part of something that's really going to change things and make things matter. And, I love how your book has the bump, then the pitch, and these kind of things, right? And like, you hear these guys talking about wine and dining these, whether it's top staff or top investors, and it's not one for one, but to me, it's just one human trying to attract another human to make a choice on their own.
Yeah.
Do you have any feedback or disagreement?
No, I think that when you're talking about convincing somebody to do something like commit treason, right, in their own context, and putting aside the fact that a lot of the people who are doing this are, probably pretty deranged. I mean, you kind of have to be a little bit out there psychologically to decide that this is sort of within the scope of what I'm willing to consider, right? So put that aside for a second. You need to have some fundamental understanding of how people work. You need to be sufficiently flexible in that understanding to realize that while there might be different categories generally, like what motivate people to do this, that everyone's decision is very intimate and personal and contingent on their own situation. So everything has to be kind of framed in that context, and that involves knowing them. And you have to know not only what is going to be the thing that motivates them, but how to walk them through that, because, and I'm not exactly sure what the analogy here to business would be, although it probably, as I'm saying it, will come up with one, is like the cold pitch, doesn't typically work. Some of the best, what my case officer colleagues will say is a lot of the best assets, they're volunteers, because they've kind of already crossed that line themselves. They just need a little bit of help to do it. It takes a measure of, it takes an incredible amount of perception about the deep things inside a person to kind of move them at the right time and the right pace through that cycle. And I think you can find a lot of different, parallels in the business world. One of the things that I did some research for the third book in Las Vegas, and I spent some time with a casino host out there who basically is the point person for really high net worth individuals who come to, the casino and resort to gamble. And there are, in that role, a lot of similarities with a case officer, and that you're sort of walking this line of like, intimacy, friendship, some amount of manipulation too, but the best and most fruitful relationships are ones that actually are friendships, so it's not fake. So there's all kinds of, I think, sort of non-CIA, non-sort of formal human collection parallels here, for sure.
Yeah, I want to talk about this because, so I had two guys on the show yesterday. One built a company, took it public, hit a max valuation of $4 billion. Now he's building a new AI, like how you can get AI to write your code for you. It's called Bitto. It's great. Okay. And then the other one is guy used to be president at SAP. Now he's the CEO of this fast growing cloud company called Cohesity. They're like, I don't know, I want to say 3.7 billion or something. Right. And we were talking, and I apologize, I can't remember which conversation it was. We talked about sales. And one of the engineers said, well, I just don't think I could do sales. I don't think I could lie for a living. And he was like, oh my gosh, that's what sales must look like from the outside.
Yeah.
But anybody who has sold something for millions of dollars or gotten millions of dollars invested, like where there's a sales process, this is weeks, this is months, right? Lying is not going to do you a favor. Educating people and helping them come to their own conclusion. It's like that movie Inception. Is the only way this lasts, that they don't get buyer's remorse. Like, my grandpa, my hero in life, used to say, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can verbal judo people into something out of force of will and personality and, like sales techniques like sell or be sold, where you're like adversarial, right? Yeah, and then they go home and change their mind and they cancel the check, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
And
totally.
you never get it through committee, like on these big multi-million-dollar contracts for enterprise sales, right? And to me, like, I think that recruiting sources is similarly misunderstood from outsiders. When I hear so one of my biggest mentors in life, probably the most influential person I've ever met, it was counter intel for the bureau, right? And when he is recruiting, whether it's a diplomat or a foreign intelligence officer who's in America trying to steal our secrets and he needs to turn them to double to go the other direction, right? These people are genuinely risking having their families murdered back in the country they're from, things like this, right?
Absolutely.
He's like, you can't lie to sources. Like, you have to understand how to handle them and help them through the emotional state. And maybe you're not giving them all the information at first because you need to guide them. But he's like, no, this is like a serious, like, building a relationship of trust. Like, he's in contact with these people years after they're no longer, it's hard to say the word terminated because people think you're killing somebody.
No, I know, but it's the word you use. Yeah.
This source is no longer providing information. Is terminated. They didn't kill somebody. But like, long after sources were terminated, they're like, you're one of my best friends. They're still in contact and these kind of things, right? Because it's like, anyways, the operations officers and case officers I have the most respect for tell me it's not lying. It's building a genuine relationship. However, it can be with somebody who you wouldn't normally invite over for dinner. Like, there's parts of them you might have to be ignoring, and it's like trying to uncover the humanity in this person I'm going to connect with. Anyways, do you have any thoughts about any of that?
Yeah, I don't think the basis for, well, a step back. I do think there's a theme in a lot of spy fiction, certainly in a lot of Hollywood portrayals of the role of the case officer, and they very rarely actually get the words right to describe the role, right? Describe them as a spy. It's like, no, the spy is the foreigner who's stealing the secrets. But the depiction of the case officer is often one as sort of this professional liar deceiver, right? Lying to everybody. I don't think that's not usually true, and certainly not when it comes to the relationship with the asset, as you know, because the productive relationships can involve a degree of manipulation, and it can certainly involve a degree of not telling the entire truth right up front. But the basis for cooperation typically is built off of an understanding, a clear-eyed understanding of the agreement that's made and who each party is, right? At least sort of in the traditional construct of a handler-asset relationship. And I think that, it's sort of profoundly, especially from the outside, kind of looking in and looking at CIA through the lens of Hollywood or, leaks to the New York Times or WAPO or whatever, like there's kind of this view of like, oh, it's just it's just a lot of deception. And I think the paradox is that, CIA is a fundamentally secretive organization, but the currency inside of it is actually the truth. And I think that's true when you're talking about analytical judgments. I think it's true when you're talking about the relationship between a case officer and an asset. And it's also true when you're talking about, okay, if you're a case officer, you can't be lying because you're operating with such leash anyway that really all you have with respect to your, reputation is, can Langley trust you? Can your chief of station trust you? Because this isn't a job where you're, someone's looking over your shoulder for 12 hours a day. You're operating with a tremendous amount of leeway, and your judgment has to be trusted. Which is why, I think I have the line at Damascus Station. Like, you sort of get, you kind of get one, screw up, but if you come clean, it can be forgiven, but the point is you have to tell the truth. And if you start to deceive or cover things up, be it with the agency or with an asset, you fundamentally can't operate in the role. And I think that paradox of, the agency as being this sort of secrecy and deception cloaked institution that's also fundamentally committed to the truth, and where kind of the ethos of the place, the motto that's up on the wall, in front of literally on the opposing wall to the memorial wall that has all the stars for fallen officers, is John 8:32, which is, "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," because there's this commitment to the truth as the fundamental currency of the place that I think it's not well understood outside.
Yeah. And I'm fine with the argument of there are many ways that the analogy doesn't make sense. And there are absolutely times when a case officer or operations officer or somebody is involved in deception, especially of the local intelligence and local law enforcement. I'm not saying that it's 100%, but one of the things I'm constantly asking these individuals, whether they are a billionaire or built $1 billion company, is about fundraising. And then one of the things that other entrepreneurs are constantly asking me is about fundraising, right? And so often people get it wrong in the sense of they think they're going to come up with the best thing since sliced bread, and they're just going to show up and say "Hey, look at how great look at how great our company would be to invest in. Just buy it." And yet the people I know who have raised hundreds of millions of dollars are incredibly good listeners, and they are incredibly good at reading the people, and they spend so much time editing their own sales pitch to match it to what that investor is looking for in life. And there's a sophistication of understanding money is not the same, because this investor is allowed to buy debt, this investor is allowed to buy real estate, but only this kind of real estate. These, there's so many flavors of money that when people achieve mastery, they know to show up and say, instead of show up and throw up, right? They know to the equivalent of a bump, right? You're at some conference, you're at some cocktail party, you're at something, and it's just the right things to say so this person realizes, oh, they're using those acronyms, that must mean they're on the level. And he just teased me with something that created so much curiosity. I actually do want to have a meeting to find out what that deal is, right?
Yeah.
And then when you get there, not sharing your deal, asking about their mandate, asking about what they invested in the past, asking about what success looks like to them before getting to how what I have might or might not match with what you think you're doing. And the worst pitches, whether this is sales or whether this is fundraising, is I have a deal that's really good. Hey, buddy, that's up to me to decide if yours is a good deal, not up to you. You don't even know what I'm looking for, right? Try on these glasses. You'll be able to see great, right?
Yeah.
But you think about that space of in human intelligence of being able to understand what and why this source, what's success to them, what they're looking for, maybe I shouldn't name names. Somebody was telling me about, working on a counter-nuclear program in a country that is known for hating us. And their source wouldn't take money and said, no, those idiots at the top, I think our country needs nuclear for energy. And I think those idiots at the top are betraying our entire country by turning it into weapons. And I don't need money. I'm doing this for my country, not for your country,
Yeah.
And you need to listen first to find that, because you're going to offend the guy with money, right? Because he's doing it for a noble purpose. Anyways, any reactions to all that?
No, yeah. I think, oftentimes the what's motivating somebody can be a very simple thing, but getting to the specific ways it manifests itself in their own personal or professional or familial context, and really knowing how you can meet them at that moment to nudge, push, compel, persuade, whatever, them to take, a very significant step. That's the art of it that requires, I think, a lot of wisdom and maturity in how you interact with other people, and listening is a huge part of that, because you really can't, again, there's tons of sort of pretty gruff pitches and cold pitches and things like that can work because it's a more mercenary kind of setup. But if you're talking about somebody who, could be a long-term, asset reporter or whatever, you're going to need to develop a pretty detailed understanding of how that person works and what makes them tick. And it's really hard to do that. Like you can't sit down with somebody even for, you can't sit down with someone for an hour, even if you're having a good conversation and really get there. You know what I mean? Like, you're just not going to get there. In most cases, it's a longer process of sort of listening to them, being with them and experiencing them so that you can figure out the best way to sort of move the piece forward, right? Because it is, I think sales is an interesting analogy because it's like you are looking for something here. This isn't just a breezy, we're all hanging out and it's fine if in 6 months, we're all just kind of continuing to hang out. That's not it. But at the same time, if you try to push it too hard, if you, make them believe that they're not important or that you're the man and so they should obviously do what you want, it just doesn't really work that way. I think that's right.
As I've been learning the recruitment cycle over years so we can help law enforcement at Child Rescue Association, the only analogy that comes up more than sales from these pros is romance. And they talk to me about getting a date and, and then getting a second date. And this idea of like, how can you have them safe enough to go shields down so you can find out what's really going on so that you can know what is going, what to do next so that they will want to go on the second date with you and the third date and when things get pressure and they get scared that they're still going to choose you instead of dump you, I kind of want to go the opposite direction here with this. Okay, so let's talk about, I love sales because you can be there and you can feel it and then you can react. And I keep changing my mind. Before we move on, I want to stop here. How do you write that? Because it's such a feeling. And you can only be so verbose before losing your reader. And people are here for an escape in fiction. And I love that you call your book a intelligence procedural because you are masterful at building tension. Like 50 people don't have to die in a chapter for me to be just as like, oh, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? As some of those books that maybe I feel like cover up weak writing with an action sequence. So first, let's start. When does Moscow X come out?
October 3rd.
Okay. And then it sounds like audio November 14th.
Trailing.
Is that what we saw on Audible? Okay.
That's right.
Can't wait for it. Super excited. But let's talk Damascus Station because I'm such a fan. Okay. I felt like I was there. I felt like I understood, at the one cocktail party where the case officer is trying to recruit her, but, there's an intelligence officer telling her you shouldn't be talking to Americans. And there's this back and forth and there's a little tension. And will she come to coffee the next day? I got this, like you were able to transfer emotion to me. I want to know how you did it.
So I think I can only tell you my sort of guidepost here when I'm writing is if upon my final read of the book, I feel like there's emotion there, there's energy there, right? And ideally I'm feeling that along the way in sort of fits and starts and at certain points where you know that you're digging, that you have tapped into something that has energy and authenticity and that, that is hopefully going to be transferable to somebody else. The transferability part is one that I find to be even more mysterious because plenty of people read the book and be like, other people will be like, I hated it, but then a lot of people will be like, I love it and I'm still thinking about it and I finished it 2 weeks ago. And so there's this sort of mysterious nature to this. And I think it kind of gets back to what we were talking about earlier with voice and all that. But putting that aside, I think what I try to do in my writing process is to spend enough time writing and to, frankly, overwrite the books. I mean, Damascus Station is 120-some thousand words. I probably wrote somewhere between 400 and 450,000 words in total. So I'm digging around, right, to find where that energy is, or to make myself accessible and open to when I strike something, I can, start to play around with it and see what it is and see if it has energy. I would say the relationship with Sam and Miriam was one of those things in Damascus Station where I hadn't intended. I mean, it's so central to the novel, right? Like it is the emotional spine of the book, and it really wasn't present in the first draft of the novel, if you can believe that. Like, it wasn't there, and I found as I was writing that there was this like connection between the characters, and as I was writing that, I was realizing that I was like, there's energy here. This is pulling me in. And it's doing it in a way that almost makes it seem like I'm not the one writing it. It's like it's there. I'm just sort of discovering it. And I'm walking into it in this very nonlinear, zigzag way to figure out what does it look like and what did they think about it. And as I wrote that, in the second, third, fourth drafts, it's like it's coming out. I was like, okay, this thing that is being excavated or pulled into the story, like this works. This has real energy and emotion to it, and I feel moved by it when I'm writing and when I'm reading and when I'm editing. And that feeling of this thing, like this is going to be the thing that pulls people into the book and pulls them through and makes them, a week later they're still thinking about it. Because I'm thinking, as the writer, I'm thinking about it. I know it has energy, and I can feel it. You find that's what you're like, how do I get this? How do I work this into the story? Then it becomes a lot easier. That's the thing that transfers to you, the reader, not to every reader, and not in the same way, shape, and form. But if that's not discovered, I don't think that many readers will have the emotional reaction that you just described, unless the author is very radically getting down to that energy in the novel, in the story that they're discovering. If you don't find that, you don't have it.
So I want to ask a follow-up question to it, but I want to take a tangent before we get there.
Let's do it.
Back to my point about the hardest thing for me is the cold pitch. Okay. And I'm talking about business, and it's marketing. Being able to write the right thing when I don't get to react and adjust. I only get to write it once, and somebody, this ideal client is going to read it without me, and I don't get to fix it. And it's like, I feel so much pressure. How am I going to get it right the first time? And conciseness and editing. And I heard a possibly off-color analogy that I thought was funny was like a mini skirt, like long enough to cover all the important parts and short enough to keep things interesting. Okay. So I want to talk about the PDB and being concise. And can you explain to people what it is, why it's so important, and the cold pitch on what you're trying to get across there?
Yeah. So the PDB, the President's Daily Brief, is a book put together by analysts in the intelligence community. It used to be just a CIA product for the most part. That's no longer the case. It's more of a DNI level product. It's a book of what has typically been something around 10 to 15 articles. Usually they're about a page, and it kind of changes a little bit based on each president's, reading habits and desires and all that. But call it roughly a page. And the idea with these articles is, there's some question, right, or some key topic that is important enough that it merits putting in front of the president for them to read, typically in the morning. And, it's usually the what, the why, and the so what of that question or that topic. So, one example I use is when I was an analyst on Syria, a big question was, how much longer can Assad last in this conflict? And these are questions that are being asked in 2011 and 2012 and 2013. And so you're sort of describing, you're trying to figure out how do you answer that question in a page, right? How do you answer that in a page, or sort of create enough context or shape the number of scenarios that are the answer to that question in a very short, very small amount of real estate. So typically what you're doing is you're trying to make your analytic points, but then also have all the evidence for those, in that page too. So it's kind of a structure of like paragraph, bullet point that kind of make, here's the facts that prove the statement, right, from above. And then another paragraph, bullet point. It is very, and also it's being read, there's probably a briefer there, but they're not you. They didn't write it. They're presenting the whole book. So this is an article that has to be stripped of, it has to be very clear. The prose has to be very economical and also clear. The argumentation has to be transparent. It has to be stripped of sort of value judgments, emotion, right? Because this is just very analytical, precise writing. And it really has to stand up to a level of scrutiny that, you wouldn't put most writing under, because it's going to the president and it's going in a formal record, and you're not there to sort of explain, I'm going to give you 30 minutes of nuance that sort of jumps off of this piece. No, it's got to be read and absorbed in, a couple minutes. It's a very specialized type of writing. I think at its best, it's a wonderful exercise in critical thinking, and actually, until you start to write something down, oftentimes your thoughts can seem clear to you, but they're actually not clear. They're jumbled up. It's a great way to force a level of clarity in sort of critical thinking and analysis. And the result's pretty impressive. You're talking about, so much of the writing that we encounter is kind of back and forth or unclear or very subjective. So to have a book that's like 15 articles that are like very clear analysis on key topics, is a pretty impressive feat. And as a result, there's a whole, analytic apparatus inside the IC that's supporting that effort to make sure the president has, the best possible information.
Yeah. And for people who aren't nerds like me, DNI is Director of National Intelligence, IC
That's right.
Intelligence Community.
That's right.
So
you gotta let me use some acronyms. Come on, a former government, you gotta litter these things in here, keep people on their toes.
So what was this experience like? You're a CIA analyst and you're writing for the first time something that's actually going to be read by the President of the United States. What was that? Do you remember what that experience was like at all?
It's really cool. I was young. I was an intern at the time, college intern. And while I would say the feeling got less unique and maybe exhilarating over time, just because I'd done it a lot by the time I left, there's something, it can feel very profound, even if you don't exactly know what's coming out of that, right? And the president could just flip through it and then forget about it, or hand it to the National Security Advisor and say, you guys figure out what to do. I've got 600 other things on my plate. I always felt like it was a privilege to write for the PDB and to have things that really were, even though, it doesn't have my name on it and it's a CIA or a DNI product. I always felt like this is work that I'm doing. This is analysis that I believe in and that I'm, this is coming out of me. So to have the opportunity as a very young person, or, even later, to contribute to that, man, it was cool. It's to have the president read something that you write, and for there to be the potential that there's a transfer of knowledge from you to the president. Very cool. Would highly recommend.
Okay, I want to compare that. to, I'm sure you were thinking about writing a spy novel for a long time before you actually wrote the spy novel, is my guess.
Yeah,
At least some period of time.
Little bit. Yeah,
Okay.
some period of time. Yeah.
Can you talk about what you felt or what that was like to decide, no, I'm ready. I'm going to take this on?
I think it felt like I didn't have a choice. I wrote at first.
Because it was coming out of you, or why?
Yeah,
Because it was just like pressing on you, like you got to get this out.
Yeah, I felt like I had to write. I didn't know what structure it would take, and initially, it started as this very like, I was sort of processing Syria, processing the agency I had just left, and so it was much more of almost like a journaling exercise in some ways. Although parts of it were not, it was stories, some of which were made up, and just kind of like working through it. And I felt like that was just like kind of an outpouring, and it started to feel like it's addictive in some ways. Like I have to do this, So the writing process for me has always felt, I mean, since I got back into it and started writing Damascus Station and took a more objective approach to it and started to think a little bit more about, all right, I want to write a book for my nightstand, but I also, there's genre, there's structure, there's different arcs to stories, and these things are sort of, they're not natural laws, but they're close. And if there's certain things that people are going to want to read. So can I write something that feels authentic to me in my voice, and that also, can solidly live inside the conversation of the spy genre? All these things I was wrestling with, and ultimately decided, yes, I'm going to try it. But it feels like a pretty deep compulsion to write and to tell stories. And there's nothing I have yet to really find anything I've done professionally that has put me in the level of flow that writing does, where you just sit down some days at 8 and you look up and it's like, oh, it's been 5 hours. Like where did that time go? And that is, I think, doesn't happen every day. Certainly doesn't happen every week, but you kind of know you're on to something if you're pushing in a direction and you get to that level of flow. And so it just was like, I've got to do this.
Yeah. Let's have a pitch for Moscow X. Everybody who's waiting for October 3rd for this to come out, or who's listening to this after it's out, that's like, that's my next book.
Yeah. So Moscow X it started as a kind of an exercise to think about what might it look like if the agency, the CIA, from a covert action standpoint, really took the gloves off against Vladimir Putin. So the title of the novel, Moscow X, in the book, it's a fictional component of the CIA's Russia House that's been charged with taking this kind of outside-the-box, pretty aggressive approach to dealing with Putin. One of the officers, Artemis Proctor, who was in Damascus Station, she was the chief of station in Damascus, is back. She's the chief of Moscow X, and she comes up with a plan to effectively make Putin believe that a coup is underway when one is in fact not. So she uses 2 CIA officers. They're both NOCs. They're officers under non-official cover. One is a lawyer. The other one is he runs a thoroughbred horse breeding and dealing operation in Mexico. They basically, get in front of one of Putin's money men in an attempt to push this operation forward and come into contact with the money man's wife. Her name's Anna. She is a banker, but she is also an officer of the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, and she is a Russian NOC under non-official cover at the bank. And there's sort of this cat and mouse game that ensues between both sides, and we come to realize, and I won't give anything away, that Anna's playing this game that's sort of all her own. So it's a book about very modern espionage. And I think is an update on Damascus Station in that sense. But it's also, I think, a book about, vengeance and loyalty and truth and identity kind of in the middle of this shadow war between Washington and Moscow.
Okay, I'm stoked.
And I hope everyone enjoys it. It was, it nearly killed me to write it, but I'm super happy with it, and I hope to have a whole bunch of people out there who love the story too.
Okay, so we've gone through my tangent, so now I want to go back to my question. So specifically back to this, writing the bump in the pitch in Damascus Station. What's your decision tree like when it comes to how concise you're going to be, but still give the emotion? Like, what does that look like? What I'm going to leave in, what I'm going to cut?
Well, it always starts with overwriting and knowing that everything is going to be super flabby to start, but not restricting anything from coming out, because you just have to let it out. And you know that, a lot of it's going to suck. And a lot of it, like I'll spend whole days writing, and then at the end of the day, I'll look at it and say, I don't think this is going to go in anywhere. This is just isn't good. Or it doesn't fit. So you got to start, I think, from the standpoint of like, get it down on paper, right? So then you have something. You typically, at least for me, like I can't make that decision only based on a few chapters or anything like that. I typically don't start cutting things until I have a full draft of the novel, right? And what I'll then do is and honestly, a lot of this is I feel from reading and rereading obsessively chapters, graphs, sentences, words, and feeling like, okay, this works, this doesn't, this is repetitive, or, these 10 words don't need to be here. So as soon as you're going to get it down, then I think there's a drive toward figuring out where is that energy, and then also how can I cut as much as possible to strip the story down to its essence, because you have to be willing to gut a lot of stuff that you might hold dear because it's on its own, it's well written, or you thought it was fun or interesting. Like you really have to go through and kind of mercilessly cut the thing down to the bone, because like I said, there's a whole bunch of stuff in my files of like wonderful chapters that I've written or paragraphs that I think are like, oh, this is cool, this is giving some insight into the CIA. But if I reread it and I don't feel that emotion, I don't feel that energy, I don't feel that propulsion, I know that you, the reader, won't either. You're going to be bored or confused or just kind of feel like, hey, I want to get up and get a soda rather than read this. So you strip it all down and you say, how can I get down to the absolute minimum? Because it's kind of, less is more here, I think, really. Like the simpler it is, the more stripped down it is, the harder it's going to punch.
I love that answer. Who are a handful of your favorite authors in the, espionage fiction genre?
There's a lot. We've mentioned some of them. David Ignatius writes a lot of wonderful, very authentic spy fiction. And I should say I'm very omnivorous here in the genre, so I read a lot of procedural stuff that's slower burn, and then a lot of the really crackling.
Yeah, like give us
stuff.
some examples.
So I'd read Thor, Carr, Daniel Silva, the Flynn stuff we talked about. And then on the procedural side, I'll read Paul Vittich, Dan Fesperman, Joe Cannon, Le Carré. A lot of the old Charles McCary stuff is wonderful. Jason Matthews and his Red Sparrow trilogy is phenomenal. Who else? Alma Katsu, Kathleen Kent. I mean, it's like for me, I find the genre is like, I love it so much, not only just because of my background, but because I think you can have great books where you're like, Mark Greaney, stuff blowing up left and right, great action. It's like, that stuff is super fun. And it's like, I love tearing through that. Right. And then on the other hand, I.S. Berry has a book that just came out. She's a former case officer. It's called The Peacock and the Sparrow. That's an example of one that's like slow burn, great setting in Bahrain. Like you can basically just like feel the humidity coming off of the pages. Like, but it's a slower story, right? And it sort of builds to this thing. It's like, that's awesome. and I love that kind of storytelling. So I'm really kind of all over the place. Martin Cruz Smith, some people might say they're not spy novels, but I disagree. He wrote a series called Arkady Renko is a Russian police investigator. So there's this sort of like cross between intelligence and police procedural set in the Soviet Union. Those are tons of fun too.
Let's go back to Vince Flynn and the Mitch Rapp series for just a minute. That is such a standout series for so many people, myself included. In a way that, like, again, you listed so many great ones. Love the Daniel Silvas. I just did The Collector a week ago. It was so good, right? But the Vince Flynn, Mitch Rapp series, it is a little bit singular in some ways, at least in my mind. I don't know if you agree, but what do you think was special about that character and that style of writing and the political and the intellectual horsepower of Dr. Kennedy? Like, what do you think was special about that series?
I also should have said Clancy. I totally forgot. Clancy.
Of course. So many good ones, but go on.
I feel like that series does a great job with the balance between, like, it's so propulsive and action packed, and yet at the same time it doesn't, like, it also feels smart, So it's and you don't feel like characters are being shortchanged either. Like, you read those books and it's like, it doesn't, I don't know, there's never a point where you're like, oh, that seems kind of wooden. You know what I mean? Like, it definitely tilts on the side of, shoot 'em up, create like full, just you're from typically page one, it's like, we're just the gas pedals all the way down and you're just rolling. But I think, Vince and Kyle and now Don Bentley is taking over the series from Kyle, like, which I love, because I love Don and his writing, and I think he's going to carry the legacy on really well. It's like it's some ability, I think, to like write that level of action without shortchanging, without making you feel like, oh, hey, this is dumb, or like people don't actually act this way. I think balancing those things keeps you in the story. Like, as a reader, you don't pull out and be like, that's crazy, even though you're kind of in a crazy world, but inside the rules of the world, you're willing to go into it, I think, because of the level of care and attention that's been taken to balancing those things. I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious for your answer on that, but that's kind of how I would read it and think about it.
I mean, I agree with so many things you said, but you actually highlighted some stuff for me. I think in certain ways, again, so many of the other shoot 'em up stuff ends up like getting slightly fantastical, and you almost stray into comic book territory, where it's like, really? You went into a room with a pistol against how many guys with rifles, and you smoked them all, and nothing happened to you, and you know what I mean? Like, it's so fantastical, right? Where with Rapp, this idea of like, you can have your character do anything he foreshadowed, right? Like, they've done such a good job having you believe like he is the elite predator. Like, here is a guy who, all-American lacrosse, all these things, like they built up so much that you're like, oh, this is the Michael Jordan of his sport, right?
Yeah, it's a good way to say it. Yeah.
And it's like, as much as he pushes the limits, for me, I think you just brought up something of like, it's just believable enough that something like that could be going on.
Yeah.
Where like the other ones sometimes you're like, I mean, this is like, it's almost like a popcorn movie. Like, I'm not going to be rewatching this one. You know what I mean? Like, it's fun to go through it, but like, this is not going to warrant rereads over the years, right? Where like, there is enough intellectual horsepower of how the politicians are hurting the country for their own gains, and this is happening, and what's even going on. Like, I feel like the intellectual curiosity going on of what's going on for the jihadis or somebody else, instead of like two-dimensional Saturday morning cartoon villain, right? And their own political intrigue within their world, and this Saudi prince who is funding these terrorists and this, but he had to keep it secret from his brother because that would hurt the relations with America. Like, there's enough sophistication there. And again, it's almost like if you were a Jordan fan in the 90s, you wanted that second three-peat to happen. Like, you were ecstatic. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right?
That's right.
And like, I lived in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada during the Gretzky years, of the Oilers. And like you wanted Gretzky to win.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, Tiger
so
Woods.
I feel like,
I mean, the same. Yeah, absolutely.
I feel like he's tied. I feel like he and then Kyle, who I was lucky enough to have on the show, have tied into that factor enough of like, normally this would be comic book, except do you actually think Michael Jordan could make that shot? Because Michael Jordan has made so many shots that you think no one could have made that you're like willing to suspend disbelief a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
I don't know.
And I think it's character work at the end of the day. Ultimately, I do think it's that, because it's creating a character in the context of, or unearthing a character in the context of that world where that stuff is believable and authentic, and even though you know in reality, our reality, it's not. The novel obeys its own rules.
And I think there's a number of things I can admire about Mitch Rapp the person, where so often, I don't know why writers choose this, but they have the main character shoot somebody because they were really angry. And it's like, Mitch Rapp doesn't, like, there's so many times I'm like, he just killed somebody who didn't need killing. And it loses me because like there's the moral disconnect.
Yeah.
And some people can pull that off, but most can't. And I feel like his mastery of himself in so many cases is admirable. And I think that also like feeds into like the likability of the hero for a guy who's like pretty gruff and messes up a whole bunch of other things. You do see levels of self-sacrifice. You do see restraint when nobody would have known, and he does the right thing sometimes. And I think that has magnetism over, I don't know, 20 plus books or whatever it is now, right?
Yeah.
So,
well, I think, I think readers, there's some level of, I guess, kind of like you see moral formation, or sort of the actual sort of trade-offs of doing good in bad systems and, corrupts it, like, which I think, again, it sort of resonates with a lot of what we have to deal with, in this life, right? So when you see that in a character, it doesn't mean that the character has to always make the right choice, right? And I don't think Rapp always does, but you kind of have to, you have to be interested and intrigued enough by that character's journey, good and bad, to kind of go along, and you can't sustain a series on 22 or 23 books without that character being interesting, right?
And like, this is going to come back to you in a second. Like a Stan Hurley character that is just so bonkers and out there, but you can, like, if you know people in the community, you're like, that could possibly actually exist because his product is so good. He's like the annoying sales rep that like causes everybody so much heartache at work, but they bring in half the revenue for the whole company. And like the other 80 sales reps only bring as much as that one. You know what I mean? And so and I know we're over time, so I'll wrap it up. For me, Artemis. I want to talk about Artemis because you write a character that could easily slip into cartoon land. I mean, just so, a number of sharp edges, right? And like, it's like you could push past the disbelief of like somebody like that actually keeping their job in a big bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
But you were able to like stay on this side of it, and even though you're like, oh, that was rough, you still kind of love her. Like I want to. Anyways, I want to have just maybe a final thought on, as you think about writing a character that's like, they're so lovable because they're so crazy, but then you need to keep on this side of believability, and like, how do you thread that needle?
A lot of editing. I think, my tendency with her is to overdo it in the drafting process. And again, it kind of comes out of this principle of like, you kind of don't know where the line is unless you find it. And so the best way to find it is to cross it and kind of know you've crossed it and then work yourself back. So with her, because again, when I write her, like I'm down, if I'm at my computer writing a scene with her in it, I know what she sounds like. I know what she's going to say. I know what she's like. I'm in Artemis Proctor's head. So that character for me, I can write her all day, and I love doing it. But I guarantee you, and I did it in the third book, which has her in it. It's like I went overboard many times in the editing process, and having other people brought in to kind of read it and tell me where it's gone over the edge. Like they point out, like, okay, this is where it goes into, this is cartoonish. This is too much. Like this is, my agent just came back 2 weeks ago with comments on the draft and said, here's 2 or 3 points where she's not as competent as she should be, and she's a competent person like this, and this seems out of step with her character. And it's like, yeah, you're right. I've sort of gone to this point of excess, and it has to be dialed back in. So it's a balance, and it's a very fine dance. But it kind of, I think, speaks to a process in which there's a tremendous amount of creation that sort of comes out of who knows where, and is very unstructured and nonlinear and unexpected when you're going to get gold. And then that process is very, outside my former consultant, former analyst brain, right? But then you have the editing and bringing in the right people at the right time to engage in the draft. And there's that structured process that's also really important to getting the best possible story. And I think you try to do one or the other and not combine them in the creative process, you're going to end up with, you'll end up with Proctor who's sort of deadened and not interesting, or, a zany cartoon that makes you want to put the book down after 3 chapters because you just can't buy it, so you kind of need both.
Yeah. Well, I could do this for like 3 or 4 more hours, but maybe we'll just have to have you back on the show.
It's been fun. I'd love to come back on. I'd love to do that.
Okay,
It'd be great.
Let's do that. What do you want to leave people with today? Could be about fiction, could be about anything. Actually, I'm going to pause you for 1 second. We're gonna tie this back to business, okay? Because I've been binging Walter Isaacson's Elon Musk book this week, and you think about this idea, like I brought up earlier, these guys who build billion-dollar businesses, and they're all in on the vision. Like they're going for broke. Do you know what I mean? Like there is no plan B. They're going all the way. And I think about this idea of like you write the whole thing and then you edit back down to what the reader will believe and what's helpful, right? And I look at like the Elon Musks, the Richard Bransons, the Steve Jobs, the folks who genuinely pull off things that everyone else thought was crazy, like truly crazy. And they, between a number of different things, including being a big figure that could recruit people in person and not, did things that others thought were statistically absurdly unlikely, right? And like, I would say, Musk definitely has times where he should have been editing. You know what I mean? Like yeah. there are times where it was need to know information, and that, like, even if he truly believed that, he might have been better served to keep that part to himself.
Yeah.
Right. And yet in many other ways, like going whole hog, pull off things that nobody thought he could do, or any human could do, and certainly not in the time frames, or and so this idea of like really being thoughtful, like if I don't care if you want to be a pro athlete and everybody says you're not going to make it, you want to be a stand-up comic, you want to be an actor, you want to be a $1 billion investment fund or $1 billion startup founder or something, like the statistics are not in your favor, and most people are going to tell you, hey, be realistic or something like that.
Yeah.
And I thinking about what you're saying, like, to me, there's this idea of like, you need to go the whole way yourself, and then you need to edit and pull back and say, what's the right message for which audience? And just be very, very intentional of like, kind of like the like cowboy case officer meets analyst. Like cowboy case officer, go for big, analyst rein it in of who needs to know what, and maybe there's some things you're not sharing with anybody, and that's for you. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think pairing, I think this will be a good spot to close it, because I think this captures a lot of the essence of of writing, right? Is I think to get to the energy, to get to the thing that's going to make people remember the book later or increase the odds that they do, you have to sort of radically surrender ego and be open to the story that you're discovering, the characters that you're discovering, and to transmitting that onto the page, like to sort of push down or away your own sense of self or whatever structure or whatever themes or message you might think you want to tell, and put that all away and surrender to, like, just let go of your ego. And then on the flip side of it, you have to be obsessive about the editing and the reduction down to the thing that is most essential in the story. And you have to do both. I think you have to do both of those things for fiction to work.
Yeah, I love it. Let's end there. Congrats on writing a great book. Can't wait to see the next one.
No, thanks, man. Thanks for having me on. And I've got a split to go to a lunch, but I'd love to do this again. So just let me know. This was fun.
Okay, great. Thanks again. Talk soon.